Welcome to VMware in Conversation. In this series, we're exploring how Canadians and organizations within Canada are thinking about technology and adapting to a changing digital world. And for today's episode, we'll be talking about some of the largest and most influential organizations in Canada, our governments. My guest today is Rodney Halal, our National Public Sector Sales Director here at VMware Canada. Rodney has significant experience working with all levels of government in Canada, and I'm excited to hear his perspective on what Canadians want from a dynamic digital government, as well as how public sector leaders should be adapting to new technologies. Welcome, Rodney.
Thanks, Peter.
So, Rodney, first question for you. Over the last 2 years, we've moved our entire lives online. And of course, this means that we're taking more advantage of digital services in the private sector and the public sector. What have you noticed as far as changes in how Canadians are engaging with their governments?
There's definitely been that shift, right, in terms of how to engage government overall. And really, that focus on digital services means that governments had to do things much differently and obviously work in a more citizen centric fashion. So, to get a better understanding of the shift itself and what it would mean for government services going forward, we decided to survey Canadians across the country to really better understand how they use digital services and what their experience over the past couple of years has been. So, 88% of Canadians have used digital government services, which you're like, big deal. 51% of people had increased their usage during the pandemic, which is significant, but obviously no surprise because a lot of the services you'd go to day would have been closed, and the only way to access things would be online. And then, probably last but more tellingly, is that a full two-thirds of Canadians would prefer to use digital services versus in person going forward, which makes a tremendous difference moving forward in terms of how we interact with our governments day to day.
Yeah, that's a big shift for a government,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
so moving from primarily delivering services in person to now primarily delivering services digitally,
Right.
that means a huge change for a lot of things that happen in government. Yeah. So you mentioned you have a survey of Canadians. How do Canadians feel about that shift? Is the government keeping up with those new expectations?
I think they've gotten better, but it's not the best version of what it could be, right? So I think obviously there's still more work to do. There's still that gap, right? And what people expect, they want perfection. They've got these commercial applications they compare to, right, day to day. And then they look at government applications and go, okay, well, it's still somewhat outdated and it's a little kludgy and it's not easy and it's a little bit archaic and doesn't really do a lot for me. It's very, very rudimentary, right? So Canadians are they've got very high expectations on everything, right? So the first result was that 85% of respondents expected them to be as easy as online banking, which obviously you've seen these online banking apps evolve over time. And younger Canadians also want the option for one single application to do absolutely everything. Just like banking, go to I've got CIBC as an example right now as my bank. I can go there, I can do my online banking, I can, look at my Costco credit card as an example, look at all my transactions. I can do my e-transfers, and I can do a whole bunch of other things as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rodney. One of the things actually I found governments doing really well in this transition is understanding that they need to connect with citizens in all of these different ways, right? So I know, for example, my local county government, if you wanted to book a vaccination appointment, best to do it online, but you can call in if you want to, or you can walk in somewhere and get some help as well, right? Interesting people first approach that maybe governments were doing a bit better than private sector early on, for sure. But we're hearing from Canadians that there's still a bit of a gap
Right.
in expectation. In your experience, what can governments do to start to close that gap in expectations?
Right. Well, I think first and foremost, I think the government does understand that they are behind on, I'll call it, application modernization, and maybe just in terms of best practices in developing applications so that they're really, I'll call it, more user centric and more user friendly, right? The COBOL, as an example, as a programming language, still exists in the government of Canada. So you can just think about how old those apps have been, and really they're not easy to modernize, right? Because they're archaic, they're these massive monolithic systems that really can't be broken apart, and they don't want to bring these services down as well. So citizens really want those frictionless services that are easy to use, easy to access, And really, end of the day, the ones we have today, they're difficult to navigate. So the government of Canada has done something a little different, right? So we've got a new CIO, Catherine Llewellyn, who I've been lucky enough to meet at least two occasions. And they recently published something called Canada's Digital Ambition, which is based on digital standards that they've also created. And those standards really talk about the concept of iterating and improving code frequently. So when you do that, then obviously, the applications obviously are consistently being modernized, being updated. They're bug free, easy to use. More features get added over time, right, in a short amount of time, but also allowing things like working in an open source style collaboration. The net effect of all that is, okay, when you do things like that and you work in the open, iterate in the open, collaborate to improve code, you get faster applications, you get more up to date applications, and really they're just constantly evolving, like we talked about, so that they can meet the needs of Canadians in real time very quickly.
Let's transition a little bit to privacy and security. And
Sure.
this is an area that I think is very different between private sector and public sector. In private sector, everyone has an expectation of privacy and security, but at the same time, if there's a really good app, I think some people are willing to give up that privacy and just understand it. So when it comes to government services, what have you seen in the expectations of Canadians around security specifically?
Well, it's interesting to your point, right? I mean, end of the day is we typically get an app, and if we love it, we'll hit accept, 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 not really realizing what we're accepting specifically and what data we may be giving up, right? But here's what the survey found, that 60%, which is a significant amount of Canadians, feared their data could be stolen or misused, with the government applications or government programs itself. And in that case, Canadians wouldn't consent to providing more personal data, even if they felt that there was more government service being offered from the application itself. So it's interesting. It tells us that maybe, just maybe, they don't necessarily trust that the data is either going to be used the right way or will be accessed or maybe lost or stolen. So that's key, right? So I think that's one. That's going to obviously present a real challenge, Peter, moving forward, because if I'm going to use a government app, I'm going to want to know that my data is going to be secure. It's not going to be misused. It's only going to be used for the intent it was meant for. And they only want it to be used for the intention was collected for. So in my case, in your case, everybody else's case, if it's for taxes, it's only to be used for taxes and nothing else, real. And I think that's key. We saw recent data breaches as well, where especially in government Canada, where over 100,000 users had their information accessed by bad actors. When those things happen, people lose trust in the applications themselves, and then they'll retreat back to kind of pen and paper processes in dealing with the government, right? So, and then they will focus on that as well to make sure there's more rigorous privacy measures. If you're interchanging information with the government of Canada, that they're absolutely going to do their best possible, everything possible to ensure that it's going to be secure. And the way to really to do that is to make sure when you're building applications, Peter, you really have to make sure you've got that security built in from inception, so that when the application is released, you're not going to have those security vulnerabilities and code issues as well.
Agreed. There's an interesting push and pull I've
It
noticed
is.
when people are expecting things from government applications. Push is, I've already given you this information once. Why do you ask it every single time I fill in something? I have noticed in speaking with privacy commissioners in various governments in Canada that those are hard lines between departments, that this data cannot be shared with other
They
departments.
are, absolutely.
And to a certain extent, governments are a little bit more limited than private sector in how they can build these applications, because the data really cannot traverse across those walls that exist in government.
Peter, I think really policy has to change, right, in order to share that data. And you think about is that, I can share my correct information with Revenue Canada today in terms of name, address, email address, phone number. Another government department may start emailing me with completely different information, right? Or they sent it to my wrong address, or still have my wrong phone number or the wrong data. And you go, how can this happen? It's the government. But they're also trying to, kind of keep your best interests and privacy in mind as well. And that's why they're not sharing that information.
Yeah. One of the interesting additional complexities that I've seen working with government customers is the need for sovereignty. And there's so many interesting cloud capabilities available. But at the same time, it's important that we keep the data within Canada, monitored by Canadians and to Canadian standards. And there's been an interesting rise of sovereign cloud in Canada that is a nice way to balance those things to get really cool application functionality while at the same time maintaining the sovereignty of that application as well.
Right, absolutely. We're seeing that as well. It's funny, we had a conversation with one of VMware's sovereign cloud partners and providers this morning as well. That was one of the conversations we had, which is, what's going to differentiate you from, call it, some of the different hyperscalers that obviously have a global presence. And really what has to happen is that sovereignty itself is a key feature, because that means your data can't drift beyond borders, won't be used in other areas of the globe and in the US and other places as well, which really Canadians want. They want to make sure that their data is retained in Canada, accessible in Canada, and only to be used in Canada and not anywhere else.
All right. Well, thank you, Rodney. I've really enjoyed this conversation and an opportunity to dig in a little bit more to the survey data.
Likewise.
And with that, thank you to our viewers. Be on the lookout for the next VMware in Conversation episodes coming your way soon.